I'm going to call the Mobile Source Committee meeting to order. I see Mayor McCullen and Mayor Mitchell. Pro Tem Mitchell. Is Mrs. Solis or Dr. Liu there also?
Dr. Liu will not be here today. I think he's in Florida at a bar meeting.
Okay. And Dr. Solis, I see that Supervisor Ashley has not arrived as of yet. Will he be attending?
Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Ashley will not be participating as well.
Okay, and I see Supervisor Solis. All right, well, let's get started. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I guess we have up first is Dr. Fine. Summary of the 2017 PM 2.5 levels and progress towards PM 2.5 attainment. Dr. Fine, go right ahead.
Good morning, Dr. Parker, members of the committee. As we do pretty much every year, we come to this committee to talk about the air quality measurements in the previous year, and we've recently pulled together the PM 2.5 data for the year of 2017. And as you know, we talk a lot about our ozone standards, and those are the most challenging in terms of emission reduction. But PM 2.5, we still do not attain the federal and some state standards for PM 2.5. And most of the health effects we think about that come from air pollution are actually caused by PM 2.5. So it's still very important to us. And so what I'd like to talk about today is what happened in 2017 and put that in historical context in terms of trends and where we need to head in the future to make sure we attain those standards. So just by way of background, there are two separate federal standards, National Ambient Air Quality Standards for PM 2.5. There's an annual standard, which essentially looks at all the data at each station throughout the entire year, and there's a scheme, but more simply, it basically averages that data. It does it by quarter, but you basically average that data over 3 years, and then you have something called a design value. And the design value is the results of that calculation, and that is the number that gets compared to the National Ambient Air Quality Standard of 12 micrograms per cubic meter. These slides show how that is calculated. The attainment date for the annual standard of 12 micrograms per cubic meter is anticipated to be 2025. We requested what's called a bump up in the 2016 AQMP to a serious area for PM 2.5, which gives us a little more time, it's a little bit more restrictive, but 2025 is our attainment date in the 2016 AQMP. Of course, EPA has to approve that change in attainment classification, which they have not yet done. It's still, the 2016 AQMP has not been acted on yet, but we anticipate 2025. There's another standard, the 24-hour standard, or the daily standard, and the value for that is 35 micrograms per cubic meter. The calculation that gets compared to 35 micrograms per cubic meter is a little more complicated than the annual standard. You look at each year, and you basically don't take the highest value you see in any particular day. You take the 98th percentile, the 98th highest day in that year. So that means depending on how frequent you sample at that site, whether it's every day or every third day or every sixth day, it's either the 8th highest or the 3rd highest or the 2nd highest value of that year. You do that every year at each station, and then you average all those 3 years to get your design value. A little more complicated. The reason EPA does it this way is they don't want one particular really, really unusual bad day driving your entire 3-year attainment status. So the 98th percentile is a way to kind of smooth out your trends. So we'll get into some of the data and the trends over the years. So the first slide here, and we're going to focus on the annual standard of 12 micrograms per cubic meter for the first few slides. So this shows the basin design value since 2001. And you can see in 2001, our design value was 30 micrograms per cubic meter, and over just a 15 or so year period, we cut that in half. That's a huge success story. In fact, the old annual standard was 15 micrograms per cubic meter, and now our annual design value is below that. However, there is a new standard of 12 micrograms per cubic meter, as I mentioned, with this 2005 attainment deadline, and of course it's a 3-year average, so it's really 2023 through 2025. And the small exception I'll talk about in a moment. This is the exception. So several years ago, about 5 years ago, the EPA required that we do PM 2.5 monitoring next to freeways, and not just any freeway, but the busiest freeways with the most PM emissions in our basin. So we have done that, but in order to get a design value for those sites, we had to wait 3 years to get that average. So that 3 years just completed in 2017. So now we have design values for those near road sites. So one of the near road sites is near the I-710. The other one is inland, not so far from Mira Loma, and that is shown here in purple. And that's another 2017 value. And this is the near road site near the 60 in that same area as Mira Loma. So you see it's a little higher, not a lot higher. It's maybe 1 microgram per cubic meter higher by virtue of being near the roadway. So this tells us a couple things. One thing it tells us is when we're planning for attainment, we will likely have to take this new site into account. So we might have taken that mini step back 1 microgram per cubic meter or so, because we will have to bring this site into attainment as well. Another thing to think about is the difference between the Mira Loma site and this site, which are essentially experience the same regional pollution. There's a difference, and an important difference when it comes to that attainment line, but it is only about an increase of 10% or so. So just goes to show that most of our, it's 14.6, I believe, something like that, in that range.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair. Hello.
Dr. Parker, you're
Hilda,
on mute.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, my question is, maybe I missed it. 710 freeway.
Yes.
Where does that show up on your chart?
It's not on this chart, it's on a subsequent chart, but it's around, the annual value is about 12 it's close to 12 at the I-710 freeway.
And are you looking at San Pedro? Where along the 710? That's a pretty big area.
It's close to the Long Beach Boulevard overpass, just south of that.
And is that considered one of the most hot spots on that freeway? Or I'm just thinking out loud about areas like Commerce, Vernon, those areas that it kind of passes through where you have a lot of truck mobility there.
We think it's we think it's indicative of the concentrations that people along that 710 freeway would be experiencing up and down. We tried to get the site as far south as possible because that's more trucks. The closer you are to the ports, the more trucks you have. That is a very heavily traveled freeway for heavy-duty diesel trucks. It's one thing we will be looking at in the AB 617 as we take additional measurements, but we do feel that that's very indicative. And
if you can, of what is the largest contributor to PM 2.5 as it relates to our model or mix of how we're evaluating it? What percentage is that coming from this source, that source, et cetera?
Yeah, so it's not part of this presentation, but I'm happy to do that, Dr. Parker. So, like I said, we're talking about that near road site. Most of our PM 2.5 is not emitted locally, it's regional. It's actually formed in the atmosphere from other gases that are emitted from our sources. There is maybe 20-25% of it is directly emitted, and then you have the diesel PM, the black carbon, and that's coming from diesel, and you have some other components that are directly emitted. Most of it is formed in the atmosphere, 70-80% of it. So the gases that form that PM 2.5 are NOx emissions, ammonia emissions, sulfur dioxide emissions, and then VOC emissions. And when we're talking about Miraloma, most of the PM 2.5 there is from NOx emissions. And so we know the sources of NOx when we talk about ozone. It's the diesel engines, it's the trucks, it's the trains, it's the ships, aircraft, construction equipment. So it's the same sources that lead to ozone formation, and the same pollutants that lead to ozone formation, like NOx and VOCs, are responsible for most of the PM 2.5.
And the reason why I asked the question, so what you're really saying, and I thought it was
Yeah, so as I mentioned that the most of the PM 2.5 you see is not coming from that freeway that's right next to these sites. Most of it's regional. It's being blown from upwind sites. So we know that that area in Miraloma, Ontario, has some of the highest PM 2.5 levels, and that's because it's downwind of those upwind sites and all the activity in Los Angeles County and there. So in Long Beach, you don't have as much upwind and enough time for those chemical reactions to occur to form the regional portion of PM 2.5. So that's the difference. But even at the busy 710 freeway, the amount of that 12 that's contributed by the freeway itself is probably 1 microgram per cubic meter out of the 12.
Thank you.
We bring the presentation back up.
yes, go right ahead.
So this is gets to the question that was just asked. So this is looking at design values, not across the whole basin, but actually by station, right? So here you can see that near road on the far left, the blue chart, the blue bar, is a near road site near the 60 freeway, and you can see it just a bit below 15. You can see the Miraloma site, the one we've had for a longer period of time, that is less than that. You can see that difference is about 1 microgram per cubic meter. We also have the 710 site on here, which is the next highest, the third highest, and that's just what I said, a little bit above 12. The fireworks on July 4th affecting that daily standard. We have wood smoke over Christmas and the holidays that affect that standard. But even more importantly than all that is the weather really does affect day-to-day variations of the concentrations we see. So here again, in the blue bars, I'm showing the number of days that have exceeded, that exceed across the entire basin each year, the number of days that exceed the standard of 35 micrograms per cubic meter. And obviously the trend is positive since 2000. We used to have 115, 141, 114 days that exceeded the standard. You can see that drop significantly to a low of only 9 days in 2016, and a little bit of a bump up in 2017, which I'll talk about in more detail. And as you can see, our attainment date for this standard is much sooner. It's 2019. So depending on that, we're already in that averaging period to get to 2019. So those days that we see now from 2017, 2018, 19 are very critical to our attainment status. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But you can see that in 2016, there were only 9 days that exceeded the standard. And that's across all our sites. When you actually look at individual sites, which is how we're judged, there was no more than 7 or 8 days that exceeded standard. So in that single year, 2016, we actually would have attained the standard. If it was a 1 year, that's the blue bar. Yeah, that still exceeds the standard, but it's actually lower for whatever reason than the Miraloma site. And you can also look at the near road site at the 710. I think it's the 5th bar from the left. That actually meets the standard, and it is maybe higher than some of our sites in Long Beach in that area. But it doesn't look like the near road sites are going to necessarily be the drivers for the 24-hour standard like they will be for the annual standard. So we're still looking at Miraloma as a driving site. You have Compton here as well, and I think that's a bit of an anomaly. Compton had a very high year in 2017. We think largely due to wildfires. But there's still some work to be done on that. So normally Compton is not a design value, is not our highest site. It still isn't our highest site, but it did pop up close to it because of an unusual year in that Compton area. But we're still doing some work to see what the impact from wildfires is on that site. questions on this slide before I move on?
Just on Compton, why wildfires would affect Compton and not, say, other places?
It did affect other places as well, and we're still looking into that. The typical way we get affected by wildfires is there's a wildfire up in the San Gabriel Mountains or in Orange County, and we could see that plume go right over our sites, and it's very clear that there's a large effect. What we think we saw, and I'm going to get into this in a moment, here, we expect in a normal year it would not be our design value site.
Okay.
Mr. Chair? Mr. Chair, this is Hilda Elise. Hello? Hello?
Dr. Parker, you're on mute.
I'm just trying to...
Go right ahead.
Okay, my question also relates to the fires, because we had two major fires. One, you said already in Ventura, but Las Tunas as well as in Bel Air. And I'm just wondering if we should be looking at more predictability in our methodology as we move forward, because we are in a drought again, and wondering if we could start to maybe work closely with our other partners. I know, for example, the California Department of Forestry, as well as the firefighter groups and statewide as well as local, that could be somehow given this information to work along with us, so we could clear some of the shrubs and areas that could be potentially
districts and the fire agencies. And so the issues in terms of understanding what are the weather impacts, whether it be drought, whether it be ongoing burns. There's also the issue of certain technologies that need permits that the firefighting agencies can use. So for instance, incinerator curtains has been a big issue that we need to work out for their use and implementation. We're doing that with both EPA, CAPCOA, CARB, CAL FIRE.
Legislation too.
And the legislation. So there are a number of efforts where we're trying to enhance the coordination to both reduce the potential for the wildfires that we've seen and to better enhance the overall response, both in terms of the actual response from our perspective to the monitoring, but also the information deployment as well. How do we work with the schools and let the schools sort of make decisions in terms of what they're allowing? So there's a lot of efforts that are going on in the space that you just described, and hopefully I've been able to address most of those concerns.
I'm sorry, I look forward to hearing any more specific information and how we can work better legislatively, as well as coordinating with our counties on the ground. And I'm obviously concerned about LA County because we were severely impacted by the fires for several days. Even where I live in the San Gabriel Valley, air quality was very, very poor for several days. And we had alerts in terms of, we know that we had a lot of emergency use at our hospital.
You're probably exceeding the standard. If you have 7 days above the standard, you're actually not exceeding the standard, because the 98th percentile is typically the 8th highest. So you can see we're very close to the standard in 2012. In that single year, we only had 7 days that exceeded the standard. And again, you see the number 35.1, which technically meets the standard because you have to be below 35.4 with the rounding conventions. You can see again in 2016 about the same thing, 7 days above the standard, and we would have met the standard in the single year. Of course, it takes a 3-year average, so that's why we still don't attain the standard. And you can also look at 2015, which we were at this committee talking about, a year that had a lot of days that exceeded the standard. That was that drought year, had hardly any rain in our season, which is, we get these highest levels between November and February, and that was that anomaly. And then it came down the next year, we got a lot more rain, and then this year we didn't get as much rain, obviously. We haven't got hardly any rain this winter. This only reflects through December of 2017. We don't have all the data all put together for January and February yet. We'll be back at committee to talk about the no burn, and I'll get into that in a future meeting. But you can see at least, in 2017, we had 10 days exceeding the standard at Miraloma, our design value site, which would lead to a 98th percentile of 40. However, some of those 10 days we think were impacted by wildfires. It could be exceptional events. It's not as clear as some of the other we get those highest levels. So the first thing to notice from this chart is that things are getting better. As I showed in the previous slides, there's less red and orange at the bottom of the chart than at the top of the chart. You also see that if there is any recent yellow or orange, it is in that January, February, November, December timeframe. You see July pick up, that's July 4th or July 5th. And that's an exceptional event that we can apply for. So you can look at 2017, which was the focus of this presentation, and you see our November had 5 days, our December had 8 days. This is across the basin, not just at Miraloma, so some days Miraloma is okay and other sites are higher, which is why it's greater than that 10 number. But you can see it's still November, December, and you can see we really hardly get any exceedances at all outside that season. And you can compare that real quick. I could flip back and forth if you'd like to the number of rain days, and you could really see in 2015 here that there were only a handful of rain days in January, February of 2015, 4 in January 2015, 3 in February 2015, 1 in November, 5 in December. So whole months in the winter with most of the days, 80–90% of the days without any rain. That's what led to those high levels in 2015. 2016 was a little better, and even though we don't have as many rain days as we get historically, the weather was stormy, and that still helps as well. 2017, you can see January, February were great, 12 rain days that we had. And if I flip back, you can say December 4th and December 23rd burned for several days, and it did include the large wildfire in Ventura that was influencing us. There were 29 wildfires in Southern California. 6 were very large, including that Thomas fire in Ventura. And smoke from these fires added, obviously, more particulate matter to the air. And then we had this period in that last week that even though the fire was not quite out, but was not at its peak, we were still getting that influence from the weather patterns blowing it back in after it went out over the ocean. Again, I mentioned that we would be looking at that very carefully. Other than the wildfires, the lack of rainfall did hurt, the dry weather did hurt, and we had that limited dispersion, lack of storms, lack of rain, and so therefore, even without those wildfires, it probably wouldn't have been a great year. But we will be looking to see how many of those days that did exceed in December were actually can be attributed to some wildfire influence, and then if it is, was that what put us over the standard or not? Would it have otherwise, if but for the fire exceeded the standard, then we're responsible. Here's just another chart that shows 2017 by site. So the top site here is Miraloma across the top, and so that had 4 exceedances in November, 5 in December. That's usually our worst site. You can also see here, Compton had unusually number of high days in relative to historical. In December, you have now with this near road station near the 60. That is likely going to be our design value site going forward. The annual average was slightly higher than last year. Not the design value was lower, but the single year was just slightly higher. The first and second quarter with all that rain, even on the annual standard, did help. It was lower than all the recent years, but the fourth quarter averages was higher, again, because of what I talked about with the 24-hour standard, that those meteorological conditions weren't favorable, and we had those active fires. So this year in that, we had 6 station design values that were over the annual, and again, the near road station at the 60 freeway is likely going to be our target station going forward. And this is the first time we've had 3 years of data since it went in. So this is going to be a change going forward, and AQMPs will have to account for that. In terms of the 24-hour standard, again, we had 3 stations that are still exceeding the standard, their design values, the Miraloma station, the Compton station, which again we think is an unusual situation, and then the near road station. A lot of the same reasons led to this, right? We had The first and second quarters were very conducive to low PM 2.5 levels in terms of weather, but the fourth quarter was not great. We also had that July 5th, as usual, July 4th and July 5th as a potential exceptional event. And then the wildfire influence really in that last week and some other weeks of December had that influence. So everything you saw here.
We are allowed to exclude them to the maximum extent that we can prove that they had an effect on lifting the number of days of exceedance.
That's correct. EPA must concur with that, and there's a pretty rigorous process that we have to go through to make that demonstration. And it's not just that it had an effect, it had an effect to the extent that it caused it to exceed the standard, that otherwise would not have exceeded the standard. And part of the analysis also has to show that we've done everything we can to reduce emissions from all the other sources as well. So there's a lot of steps to go through, and EPA recently revised the procedure, and we're working through that with them.
Have in the last, say, 2 years, have we had some incidents of that nature that we have presented to EPA for them to exclude from our calculations?
Yes, we have submitted numerous exceptional event exclusions over the years, typically more for PM10, because the larger particles are influenced more by dust. So when you get the wind events, especially out in Coachella Valley, we focused a lot of our exclusions on that, and then maybe July 4th a little bit for PM 2.5.
And how it's interpreting this. So as Dr. Fine said, there's a tremendous effort underway. And I know most notably Charlene from Reno up in Nevada has been sort of leading the National Clean Air Association contingent on addressing this whole exceptional events issue.
There's a lot of activity in this area. On the other side, some areas of the country would like to declare the entire winter season an exceptional event if there is been a lack of rain or a drought, which I think is a little bit extreme as well. But the EPA has done a lot of work to make it a more formal process, a more objective process. So we're working through that process. And I know EPA has rejected exceptional event, maybe not ours. I don't know of any specifically of us, but I know in the past they have rejected it from other agencies.
My last question is, notwithstanding the exceptional events, are we on schedule to reach attainment for the 2019 and 2025 24-hour and annual attainments?
I would say it's hard to predict the weather, especially a year or two or 7 years in advance. I would say with normal weather, under normal weather patterns and the ability to exclude wildfires, that I think we're on track for attainment by our attainment deadlines. But what we've seen in recent years is that's very uncertain because year-to-year weather is having a huge effect. So on the annual standard, the weather has effect, wildfires have an effect, but it's not as extreme as on the 24-hour standard. So if I was going to say one thing, is that the annual standard on the trends you see there, it's a little more stable and we think we're heading in the right direction. The AQMP did show that we need about another microgram per cubic meter reduction with additional measures. So we're hoping the ozone measures and the NOx measures will cover that gap and get us there by 2025. 24-hour standard, it's shorter deadline and another bad year, it's hard to say.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, go right ahead, Supervisor.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just had a question regarding the 2 days in July, 4th of July and the 5th. I know we've made some tremendous movement in getting cities and others to kind of collaborate and not have as many, the allowance of fireworks in some of our cities. And in our areas of unincorporated Los Angeles County, we prohibit the use of fireworks, but nonetheless still happens. But there are cities that do permit the use of fireworks in neighboring areas in LA County. And I'm wondering what we can do to maybe talk with some of our local government friends to inform them about what is happening here and how there might be necessity to cooperate on a broader scale, regionally, especially for areas that are hard hit, where we find that pollution is around those times actually lasts more than just 2 days. And I'm thinking about areas surrounding East Los Angeles and the southeast communities as well, where we're already finding that there's heavy levels of air pollution. What can we do there to better coordinate with our local government, our cities?
Unfortunately, Derek isn't here, but I do know that this is an issue that both Mayor Cacchiotti and others have brought before us. You know, we continue to work through the COGS and the CAGs and the SCAG as well on these issues. One of the ideas that was, I know, recently brought up to us was the district's consideration of providing incentive funding to cities to not do these fireworks celebrations. It's an interesting concept. I think we'd have to look at it from a cost effectiveness perspective. We're still trying to figure out what that would entail and how it would work. So I think the best I could respond to you, supervisors, to say that we'll take under advisement your desire to improve the coordination and outreach on July 4th activities, and I'm sort of looking to staff and see if there's anything else that they could add. Phil?
We do put out advisories on those days that PM 2.5 levels are likely to be high because of fireworks. And it's not quite known what the major contributor it is, whether it's the big permitted shows by cities and Disneyland and everyone else on July 4th that are the major contributor, or the legal or sometimes illegal backyard fireworks, or smaller scale unpermitted activities. There's some indication it may be more of the smaller scale, just when you look at the patterns. We also see the same effect, maybe to a lesser extent, on January 1st for New Year's. It's not a big U.S. tradition to have fireworks on New Year's, but it is a Latin American tradition to have fireworks on New Year's. So those are mostly those smaller activities, and we do see the impact.
I know when we look at Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm, they have fireworks every day almost.
Is that?
So we don't see it. So it really does lean more toward the cities and the smaller events, like you're saying.
Wayne,
Yes,
I just have a question. One of my local government friends told me that in some cities, the revenue is generated because different charitable groups sell fireworks. And is there a way perhaps of us to think about how we might talk to them and maybe give them, and this is obviously going to take some research, but looking at helping to offset whatever cost that is, I can't imagine that it might be that great. So we may want to look at that to see how we can work with cities. This was brought up to me by a local elected official in the city of Duarte, for example. So I'm just mentioning that to see if there's any follow-up that we might be able to do.
Yeah, the city of Duarte, I think the mayor actually came in last week or the week before. So, yeah, Mayor Cacchiotti brought him in. And it was on that very issue, Supervisor. So we are starting to look into that to see if there's some aspect. Yeah. I just don't know at this point in time.
You probably need, we are creating now in our communities many of these large stadiums, like Dodger Stadium, they have fireworks many times a year. Now we're creating a new football stadium and 2 football stadiums, and we have all of these planned ones, and they spend literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, putting on these fireworks shows each year.
Yeah, they have these cleaner propellant systems that most smaller organizations don't have, and I think that's why, as Dr. Fine was describing on those big holidays, without that kind of technology, we see those spikes. But we can certainly look into helping offset. It's just that there are a lot of financial demands on us right now. We're trying to figure out how we can fulfill a lot of them.
Well, is this something that you just mentioned something that I wasn't aware of? That can you do smaller fireworks using these cleaner propellants?
You know, I'm not sure about
I
that.
recognize a lot of the stuff was basically imported from China and some of the offshore countries and not necessarily manufactured here in the United States. But should we look at to see if there's some other kind of propellant that could be used that would basically reduce the pollutants?
Well, my understanding is that organizations like Disneyland actually use compressed air. And so they have these large systems. They know what they're doing. They're doing it, like I said, almost every day when they're having fireworks. So they're able to get the fireworks at altitude to do the display without having, you know, some of these other solid propellants. And whether or not a local or a small agency could make that investment, I don't know. But we can look into it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any further questions from anyone else? Any of the other committee members? Thank you very much, Dr. Fine, and we look forward to our next update on what this dry season that has just passed is going to have on our PM 2.5, I should say, attainment levels going for, for the future. It certainly has shown that fires in the dry weather contribute greatly to this particular type of problem. And I don't know in Southern California how we can really control it more so than what we have been doing in monitoring it, because we really have very little control over the weather conditions that we are confronted with. Are there any questions from anyone there at either location concerning this particular, from the audience that would like to speak on this issue?
Public
Any
comment?
public comment?
We don't, not from my perspective here.
None from here, Dr. Parker.
All righty. Then we'll move on to the next item, which are the written reports. Any questions or concerns or comments from anyone concerning those particular written reports? Hearing none, then they will be basically received and filed to be submitted to the full board. How about the environmental project documents? It seems to be a very hot topic right now relative to how we're going to basically handle the environmental issues concerning building homes and for the homeless. Have we been confronted with any of those, Mr. Nastra, do you know of? I know Supervisor Solis, they have a horde of them that basically in the city of Los Angeles are dealing with a particular issue.
We're not aware of any that have been raised to our attention, Dr. Parker.
Okay. The reason I ask that is because basically we're talking about making all kinds of exceptions and doing this right now to speed up the process of building some of these shelters or whatever it may be. And I was wondering any that are coming before us such that would basically have an effect on what we have basically proposed that we would be doing to meet our environmental objectives and goals. Supervisor Solis, did you have a comment?
Yes, more around this part of the report regarding community Cudahy, the general plan update for staff. I understand we're looking at 1,400, over 1,400 residential units, a very small community, which is surrounded by an industrial area. So I know general plan doesn't get into the EIR, but I obviously want to know more about where this is situated, what, if there have been other records or permits where we've had any issues in the surrounding area, any history that might be of concern to residents for this project? Because it is a big project, in my opinion. Not that I'm against it. I just want to make sure that we're doing whatever we can to make sure people understand what is around them and what our responsibilities might be.
So generally, our response to this would be to comment if warranted. Which one are you specifically referring to, Supervisor? What page?
Cudahy General Plan Update. Proposed project consists of construction of 1,448 residential units, 1.8 square miles of feet of commercial use, and 1.3 million square feet of industrial use for public and institutional uses on 768 acres.
I think it's on page A15, 1, 2, 3 lines down.
Yeah, so on this particular one, we only reviewed the document. We didn't provide any comments.
The reason why I brought this up is because I'm very concerned. We're dealing with issues right now that is where we have multitude of homes and people around these industrial facilities. And as we basically expanding out and saying we need to build more homes for the homeless, etc., it seems to me, as Supervisor Solis has stated and what I have noted, that the areas, etc., where they're being proposed right now is right next to many industrial facilities. And I'm just wondering, should we really take a position more so, not necessarily talking about denying, but really of saying that these are maybe not the best kind of situations to have this kind of concentration around these industrial places. That's where the vacant land and stuff is. That's where you can find 700 acres. You're not going to find 700 acres in the metropolitan portions itself of large cities in Los Angeles County and Orange County, Riverside, and San Bernardino. But you are going to find them out in these areas where the industrial plants are. So if we, because ultimately the problem comes back to us. People are saying that these plants are polluting them and basically making it very difficult for people to live there. So maybe this is something that we should basically take a position on, at least bring to our board or to a committee to see exactly what we would have.
So Dr. Parker, we're having a number of discussions because as you said, this issue has been raised before not only us, but before CARB and many other agencies. And it all sort of focuses on land use. And then us as an agency, without that land use authority, the only thing that we can generally do is comment. There has been guidance that has been issued in the past, and there's been a lot of discussion about CARB, CAPCOA, and others revising their guidance. There's no reason why we couldn't do what you're asking. My concern is some of the resource aspects, given our current workload, and then to be able to submit a bunch of comments. It's something that I'd want to ask Dr. Fine and his team to sort of assess. And maybe what we do is, as Supervisor Solis has done, when there's a special project that we're aware of, we can make sure that we're paying more attention to that. So maybe there's a way that we can better solicit specific comments on specific projects, and then let us also evaluate if there's an opportunity to have greater engagement overall. Phil?
And Supervisor, on this particular project, the public hearing obviously already occurred, but if these large projects will come back when they're actually built, and I think that's a point we can make sure they know about the guidance and know about the issues that you talked about.
I agree with you, Dr. Parker, on our ability to weigh in when necessary. When I think about this community, I'm thinking about the closeness it has even to Exide. And I know that is something that is of still great concern to many people in this region of the southeast area of Los Angeles. So I do think we can also work with our partners in CARB and other enforcement agencies to work together, because I believe we're going to continue to see this happening unless we step up to the plate in some way. So I would agree with you, Dr. Parker, if we can explore this area in some way.
Thank you. I recognize that land use is not part of what our objectives and goals and authority is, but we get the problems dumped in our laps when people are complaining that they're being polluted. And, if we can also have something to say on the front end so that we don't have to basically be the cleanup person after it's all happened, I think it would be to our benefit to basically kind of look around the corner and says, remember now, when this begins to happen, we don't want to come back and say, now you guys go out and clean it up and impose all these rules and regulations, et cetera, on the industry, and people are saying you're putting people out of work and you put them out of jobs and all the other kinds of things, when we know that that this is not really adequate for the kind of situations that is going on to be that close to these kind of environments. Anyway, I recognize that that's beyond the pale, but I thought it would be helpful because I too had seen this particular project being introduced, and recognizing that we can't say yes or no, and probably, but we can basically talk about mitigation like we did when we were dealing with the issues itself of the warehousing, is that we said bringing all those trucks in is going to create a pollution problem, and we need to basically have someone to recognize that and to do something to help to mitigate it. Somewhere along the line, we should probably see if we can basically do something in this area. Anyway, yes.
Well, Dr. Parker, I was just going to give a little background on this issue. We actually did, a couple of years ago, support, at the board's direction, file a brief in support of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which had a CEQA threshold which required projects that were moving into areas where there were hazardous emissions to look at that as part of their CEQA process. And the case went to the California Supreme Court, which decided that CEQA requires a public agency to look at the impacts of a project on the environment, not the impacts of the existing built environment on the project. So that's not technically a part of CEQA, but we did support the Bay Area in that effort. But it doesn't mean we can't make comments when we do get a CEQA document that presents that issue, because the local government should be aware of the air quality impacts of placing new housing right in the line of existing hazardous emissions, whether they be from a stationary source or a freeway or rail yard. And so we can make those comments as part of the process.
And I would suggest that we do that. And the reason why I say that is because if we look at who is being on these various different boards, the city councils and the boards of supervisors, these are not scientists and these are not people who understand the real impact on being next to some hazardous places. And to basically, if we do nothing else but to pull their coat and say, hey, look, you need to look at this and to see about some mitigations in those areas certainly could be of benefit to them. Anyway, I saw Mrs. Mitchell, would you like to make a comment?
I just wanted to say that, the other competing public policy that we're looking at is the policy of building housing in the state of California. And we've seen some legislative bills come down that have been pretty intrusive on local land use authority. And we've also seen tremendous pushback from the local authorities on that. But some of that legislation may totally ignore the existing environmental situation and require certain high-density housing within certain distance of a transit stop. That's one of the things that we just saw recently. So there's a lot of issues at play here, and it's not that easy to sort it out. But I will tell you from the standpoint of a local government elected official, that local land use authority, it will be strongly fought, anybody who tries to erode local land use authority. That's just the way it is.
I understand. I'm not an elected official, and I certainly can appreciate the issues and problems that you have to go through in order to satisfy your constituents, but also solve some of the social problems that we are faced with. And then the technical problems that we've been basically, dumped in our laps in order to try to control and to mitigate. So it makes a very three-pronged circus that we also, we're part of, and we can't basically avoid it. Sometimes it's better to comment than it is to remain silent. That being said, any further comments from anyone? Thank you very much. Is there any other business that anyone would like to, board members or anyone from the audience there would like to comment on? Hearing none, I'm going to declare this meeting closed, and we'll see you on May 18th again. Thank you very much for coming.
Dr. Parker, excuse me. Yeah, we need to see if there's any public comment on non-agenda items.
Okay.
Public comment?
Any public comments on non-agenda items?
None here.
Not here.
Okay.
I'm here.
All righty. See you on May 18th. Thank you very much for coming. Bye-bye.